this is a really ugly title, I'm afraid. So I created a shorter title, which will give you some clue as to the basis for this general thesis. And this is a summary. So terrorism is sending a message through violence. And you can't send a message without using language. You're sending a message, for instance, to a government or to the United States or to God. And in order to send a message, you need to use violence. But terrorists are sending a message which, in order to send a message, you need to use language. But terrorists are sending a message which involves at least the threat of using violence. And you can see the importance of language in the fact that terrorists want to claim credit for their acts of violence. So that's the basic thesis about the nature of terrorism. It's sending a message. But if terrorism is language plus violence, then we need to have an understanding of what language is in order that we can have a coupling. We can see how a coupling between language and violence might be brought about. So the center of this talk is a presentation of an ontology of language. And then the conclusion of the talk will be to apply the language plus idea to try and give an account of what obligations are or what rules or norms are. Now, I think I have a pretty good understanding of what language is, but I'm still at the beginnings of what I think might be a good understanding about what obligations are or other kinds of deontic phenomena. And when I say I have a good understanding, that means I have an understanding which makes me happy. It wouldn't necessarily impress a linguist, for instance. All right, so in the Global Terrorism Database, which is a very useful source of data about terrorism, there is this definition. Terrorists threaten or use force. They're non-state actors. This week we have the first important example of a state actor which has been declared by President Trump to be a terrorist. But traditionally, terrorists are non-state actors who try to attain political ends, and these ends are expressed in the message through fear and coercion and so forth. Typically also, innocent people are involved. So if the threats of violence are to soldiers or to agents of the state, then that is a non-typical example of terrorism. Typical examples of terrorism involve at least some innocent people who are either threatened with violence or who actually suffer violence. Now, this is football hooliganism. One of the comparisons I will make as we go along is between terrorism on the one hand and football hooliganism on the other hand. In the case of football hooliganism, the message is, my team is better than your team. And you prove it by thumping the fans of the other team. All right, this is the agenda. I'm going to be presenting the basis for a method for predicting radicalization of terrorists or radicalization of young people. So, as we will see, the people who become radicalized to become violent terrorists go through a certain process. And it's good if you can predict which people or which groups of people will go through that process so that you can try and stop them from becoming radicalized. This is an example of a typical data mining exercise, which involves something like artificial intelligence. And that will be where the artificial intelligence dimension plays a role in what I'm talking about. And I will show how ontologies can be used to make predictions like that. I will present the beginnings of an ontology of terrorism, and then I'll show an underlying ontology of language to support that ontology of terrorism, and then I'll apply all of that to try and understand what obligations are. Obligations are created through language, as when I say I promise to finish this lecture before 3 p.m. I'm now obliged to finish this lecture before 3 p.m. Now, this is a philosophy course, and I'm talking a lot about ontologies. But when I talk about ontologies, then the artifacts I'm talking about don't look very much like works in ontology that you're familiar with from doing philosophy. And so I want to just say a few words about why or how these things called ontologies, which at the top anyway, look a little bit like a table of categories in the Aristotelian sense, how they relate more centrally to the concerns of philosophers and philosophy students. Well, the answer is that you can get a job doing ontology. So there are many websites in the United States. I imagine there are some websites in Switzerland also which advertise jobs. And one of them is called Glassdoor, and if you enter ontology into the search box, you will get dozens of positions. They are trying to hire ontologists or ontology engineers. So my students get jobs working for banks, for instance, which now have research groups which are developing ontologies of things like the stock market or tastes in fashions, for instance. So Citibank is recruiting for an ontology engineer who would have the status of vice president. One of my close friends was for a long time the vice president of, or a vice president, there are many vice presidents, of Goldman Sachs, and his job was to be the chief ontologist of Goldman Sachs. And then Amazon is hiring ontologists. The Allen Institute for Brain Science is hiring ontologists. JP Morgan and so on is hiring an ontologist. So you can get a job doing this. And I think that makes it interesting. It's actually practically useful. And I mentioned yesterday that we all have ontologies in our pockets because the Siri app in the iPhone is an ontology-driven app. And the ontology in Siri looks a little bit like this, with events and meal events and restaurants and so on, catalogued according to the type of food or the type of parking that might be associated with the search terms that you enter when you want to decide where you're going to eat tonight and where you're going to park your car. Now, Siri is used to make decisions and plan. And there are ontologies in biology, which I also talked about yesterday, which I used to make predictions, for instance, about the cancer in a patient's lung. So the gene ontology is the most important of these prediction aids in medicine. And the people have compared Siri in the iPhone with ontologies like the gene ontology used in medicine. And I want to make a similar comparison here. So the gene ontology is used to give profiles of biological phenomena. For instance, profiles of a given sample that's taken from a given patient. Now, you take a sample from a patient and you identify that the patient has this gene, PSEN1, which is presenilin, which has something to do with senility. So it's quite an interesting gene. And if this is overexpressed in a given sample from a given patient, then that's an important thing to know. Now, the gene ontology tells you why it's important. Because the gene ontology has, using something like artificial intelligence or something like text mining across biological literature, has determined what presenilin-1 does. And first of all, it's involved in beta amyloid formation, it's involved in cell differentiation, it's involved in brain development. Secondly, it's involved in, these are all biological things. Then you have molecular things, things which happen to molecules. So transport across a membrane. Presenilin helps molecules get through membranes. And This tells you where they work, where they operate. Well, they operate in the gamma secretase complex, in dendritic roots, and in regulatory protein complexes. So they regulate proteins. Now, the gene ontology tells you these kinds of things for every gene that is studied. Many, many genes have been studied a lot now. And the gene ontology has grown gradually as a result of the fact that people have been doing those studies, and it's created a catalog for all genes of what they do, what that means biologically, and where it happens. Now, it would be nice if we had something similar for what people do, for instance. We know a lot about what people say in social media and so forth. Can we find a way of using that data in order to predict what they will do? That's the underlying idea. Now, everything that I do has to do with something called basic formal ontology, which we've already talked about. And basic formal ontology was, in a sense, reverse engineered from the gene ontology. So the gene ontology has three parts: cellular components, molecular functions, biological processes. And similarly, basic formal ontology has three major categories, which are indicated here, which correspond to the corresponding three gene ontologies. These are where the Go starts, and BFO is the upper level ontology from which we can see the Go as descending. And we talked yesterday about the mental functioning ontology. So cognitive processes are processes in BFO terms. Brain regions are mental functioning related anatomical structures, which are independent continuants in BFO terms, and so forth. And then we talked about the emotion ontology. So we talked about grief and happiness and fear, which are all processes in BFO terms. We talked about physiological responses, such as blushing and rapid breathing and so forth, which are also processes in BFO terms. Thumping is an example of a behavior associated with emotion. And the idea is that we can use the emotion ontology to create what we might call sentiment profiles for people or for groups of people, for cliques, for religions, for neighborhoods, for specific drugs. So a given drug makes you happy, another drug makes you nostalgic, I don't know. But in principle, we can use the emotion ontology to create sentiment profiles of a range of different things. Shakespeare, for instance, we can give sentiment profiles for each of Shakespeare's plays, and there are text mining tools which can do that. And now the idea is that we use sentiment profiles as a way of predicting terrorist radicalization likelihood. All right, so it's already being done for related kinds of things which adolescents or young people more generally get involved with. So there are semantic web tools now using ontological frameworks related to the emotion ontology, which are being used to predict drug abuse. And we talked a little bit about this yesterday. So again, the idea is you use social media, you use epidemiological information now in order to predict patterns of drug abuse among different communities. And now the idea is that we do the same thing for terrorism. So when you're using the gene ontology, you start with a biological sample, you analyze it, you analyze the chemistry to work out what genes are involved, and then you use the gene ontology in order to determine which genes in this sample are overexpressed and which are underexpressed. And that tells you something about what is likely to happen to the patient from whom the sample was taken. Now, similarly, when you're trying to predict terrorism or predict radicalization to being a terrorist, then what you do is you take somebody's email communications or their Twitter feeds or whatever it might be, and then you perform natural language processing to get a profile of the words the people are using, and then you use a terrorism ontology to create a terrorism-focused or terrorism-sensitive profile for the person in question, and you compare this with the profiles for non-terrorists, for normal people. And then if the comparison says, well, Jim is really just a normal person, he's not expressing the sorts of word patterns which are characteristic of terrorism, then you move on to the next candidate. But if Jim is over-expressing certain words or certain phrases or certain patterns of words, then you put him on your list of people who should be observed because of likelihood of becoming radicalized or of behaving in terrorist acts. So this is the idea. And again, it's happening already. People are already doing things like this. So this is an example of a paper on counter-terrorism mining. The idea is that you have people on a watch list. You already know that certain people are high likelihood candidates for terrorist acts, perhaps because they have friends who were already caught committing terrorist acts. You do sentiment profiles for those people. That gives you a baseline. It gives you the normal case for terrorists. And then you check other people to see whether they have the same patterns as the people on your watch list. And again, this is done on the basis of ontological applications very similar to the sorts of applications we've been describing so far. Now, you can do this also for diseases. So there is an app called Sick Weather, which is an app for forecasting social networks based on analyzing social network traffic, incidence of diseases. So should you send your child to school tomorrow? Well, if your school is known to be full of people infected with the flu, for instance, then you may think twice about sending your kid to school tomorrow. So again, these apps already exist and they're already being used. So this is another example of such an app which gives you signals about where in New York you have outbreaks of specific kinds of infections, or and based on not just on social media but also on statistics relating to sales of drugs in pharmaceutical drugs in pharmacies and so forth. And then we have not just infectious disease monitoring apps, but also quite general public health, universal public health surveillance apps, which are being used based on all kinds of data, including the same kinds of medical prescription data that I referred to already. And this is just another one. So the idea of this paper is really just to prove the method works. So you take Turkish tweets and you show that you can analyze these Turkish tweets using an ontology in order to get valuable information about health-related matters. And then a more specific one would detect suicide risk. So that's not general public health. This is quite specific public health-related syndrome detecting, in this case, likelihood of suicide. And as I already pointed out, there is a journal of biomedical semantics which is devoted to ontology-driven research, such as text mining, but also other kinds of research, which is designed to contribute either to medical research or to public health surveillance or to other biologically and medically related activities along these lines. All right, so now let's go back to terrorism. I talked yesterday about driverless cars and about the degree to which, in order to create software that would be able to drive a car autonomously, we would need to take account of a huge range of data relating not just to things like car engines and weather and roads and friction and velocity and so forth, but also about crime and pedestrian behavior and political events and also musical events, because the cars would have to know why there are lots of people wandering around the street with guitars in the middle of the night. So to solve the problem of driverless cars, you need software which can integrate across a huge spectrum of different kinds of data. And exactly the same applies to terrorism. So practically anything can be relevant to the phenomenon of terrorism. And if you want an ontology of terrorism, then you're going to have to cover a huge range of different kinds of data. And this is just a list. So religion is an obvious one, but also economics is going to be another one. The way towns are structured is relevant. Psychology is relevant. Transport is relevant, because they use transport, and sometimes they target transport, and so on and so on. And I am working with people who are building ontology frameworks to cover all of these kinds of data simultaneously. All right, so the main focus for the next section is going to be on predicting radicalization. And there is a very important document which is this empirical assessment of domestic radicalization document, which is a huge study of this question: how can we predict radicalization? And the idea was, we know that some people become radicalized, and we know the demographics of these people, we know their school background, we know their family background, we know a lot about those people. The question is, can we predict in advance which people are likely to become radicalized? And if we can, then which are the signals which enable such prediction? What are the causal pathways to violent extremism? And can we find data which would enable us to, can we find signals, for instance, in social media or somewhere else, which would enable us to pick those candidates which are highly likely to become radicalized? And now the first thing that is surprising, perhaps, is that conversion to Islam is not a very good signal. And we'll see some examples of why that's not a good signal in a minute. So what is a good signal is alienation and mental instability. And these are characteristic not just of contemporary Islamic terrorism, but they've been characteristic of terrorists in previous generations. Anarchists, for instance, at the turn of the century, they tended to be unstable mentally. They were outsiders. They didn't fit in. And so the EARD, this big study, came to the conclusion that the two signals for terrorist radicalization, which had some causal weight, were, on the one hand, involvement in petty crime. So they put drug dealing, for instance. And then the other one was some kind of mental instability. So involvement in petty crime goes hand in hand with clique membership. So it wasn't that you were involved in alone petty crime, you were part of a clique, members of which had been caught engaging in criminal activities. So, Scott Atran, who is an American he lives in Paris, but he's an American. He studies radicalization in France, Belgium, Spain, and so forth. And he really has made a huge catalog, a huge documentation of the kinds of people who become radicalized. And his conclusion is that, for instance, out of 11 ISIS sympathizers captured in Barcelona, 5 were recent atheist or Christian converts. Now, if you're going to predict, you're going to have to predict before they convert. And Islam is not a good, already believing in Islam is not a good signal for predicting conversion. And so if you rely on already being a believer in Islam, then you're not going to have a good ability to predict radicalization on the part of a large fraction of the people involved. So the one famous example is Michael Zehaf Bibo. So he was a self-styled ISIS follower. He hadn't actually been in communication with ISIS, but he identified with ISIS. He had a history of mental illness and a history of crack cocaine usage and a history of run-ins with the law. So he is, from the point of view of the EDAR results, he's a typical case. He is one of the people who, on the basis of the signals that they identify as being causally useful, he's one of the people who might have been identified before he became radicalized. All right, so if involvement in petty crime is an important signal for predicting radicalization, then we have a huge body of data about people who are involved in petty crime. And that body of data is collected by the police. Now, the police use ontologies also. They have something called, well, there are several of these systems, of course, and I'm sure there are systems like this in Switzerland too. But in America, one of them is called COPLINK. And COPLINK is it's really a large and ambitious database system for keeping track of criminal events, all criminal events. So you keep track of people, you keep track of the people that they are in touch with, and you keep track of the events that they're involved in. Now, in order to select from this gigantic body of data about all criminals, those data which are relevant to terrorist activity, there is a second artifact which is called TMODS, which is a terrorist modus operandi detection system ontology, which filters out those kinds of data in COPLINK which are relevant to terrorist activity. So, for instance, renting a truck, buying fertilizer, talking to such and such people who've already been identified as terrorists, these are all filtered out by TMODS from the larger body of COPLINK data. So, as we've already said, there's a high correlation between participation in terrorist acts and participation in criminal acts. COPLINK captures huge amounts of data relating to criminal acts, and a significant fraction of that data turns out to be relevant to terrorist acts. And moreover, this is more than just identifying cliques within a given population. Another feature of terrorist acts is that they very often become involved with transnational criminal organizations. So they share data, they share money, they share drug dealing operations, and so you can use the combination of TMODS with COPLINK also to identify patterns relating to these kinds of transnational interactions between terrorist organizations on the one hand and international criminal organizations on the other hand. Now, TMODS is a real ontology. So in the sense I've been describing already, it deals with universals like truck or person or act of renting, where COP-link is a database, so it deals with particulars, such as Michael or Bill, and with specific phone calls and specific buildings and specific purchases and so forth. And so you link the two. This is just an illustration of the kind of thing that you can do with tmods. So a suspicious individual is an individual who doesn't have a valid ID or who is connected with a suspicious individual or who is connected with a with a multiplicity of suspicious individuals. And people have criminal records, they engage in specific kinds of offenses and so on. All of these things are captured by using the tmods ontology. And then you link what you know from the tmods ontology to the database of particulars that you have collected in COP-link. And you can identify patterns over here because the patterns characteristically associated with terrorist activities are already selected in tmods over there. All right. So this is just another view. This is it's a book on this issue that I referred to earlier, which is the way in which terrorist organizations work with transnational criminal organizations. This was created, this book was published by the Special Forces University in the United States. And the reason I mention it here is one of the chapters was written by one of my students who, he's now a colonel in the army. He did his PhD on the ontology of war, and he wrote the PhD in Iraq. And everything that he's done since writing his PhD has been relating to the use of ontology to help, for instance, fight terrorism. And so here is, this paper, or this chapter, is about the various ways in which terrorists and criminal organizations collaborate. They share tactics, they share training, infrastructure, and so forth. And this is a picture of him. All right, so, and the slides were made by him. I adapted them for my own purposes here. So this is a way in which we can use ontology in order to show connections between various different aspects of terrorist radicalization and, in principle, also terrorist events. So this is all Belgium. So there is this instance. It's an instance of the kind location. Actually, no. It's an instance of the kind mosque. So this is the Grand Mosque of Belgium. This is a 19-year-old Belgian male who is a member of the congregation which is located in this mosque. And this Belgian male is also a participant in a certain Salafist social network which coordinates a demonstration in which he participates, and the jihadist ideology that he believes in prescribes doing certain things at this demonstration, shouting certain words, for instance. That's language plus. This is language plus now. And there is a Salafist website which this individual subscribes to. Now, many of the relations on this diagram here can be identified through mining social media and so forth. Now, this Salafist website maintains something called the Kaleidoscope of Global Jihad, and this is an international body of which this local Salafist network is a part. So now we're generalizing to the international sphere. And it's actually this which maintains the Salafist website, but there is a local version of this Salafist website which is around the Grand Mosque of Belgium and then the various sub-organizations which the Grand Mosque of Belgium is linked to. All right, now we're seeing the same thing, but we're seeing it from a clearer ontological point of view. Down here we have all the particulars, and up here we have all the universals. So this young man here is an instance of the kind person. The Grand Mosque is an instance of the kind mosque. The website is an instance of the kind Salafist website, and so on. And you see that some of these things are, in BFO terms, object aggregates. So they're collections of objects, collections of people, for instance. And this demonstration here is an instance of the kind demonstration, which is a BFO process. So the BFO terms are in the top, and then we have domain ontology terms here in the middle, and many of these terms would come from a terrorism ontology. And then we have our data about particulars along the bottom. And now, radicalization. So how did our 19-year-old Belgian male become radicalized? Well, he attended the mosque. He became involved with the Salafist network. But then people from the Salafist network started grooming him. So they talked to him, they invited him to meetings, they made friends, they introduced him to other friends, and then gradually they started recruiting him. So they brought him into a closer web of people who were already radicalized. And then they started training him, not only in religious matters, but also in military matters. They started training him about bombs and so forth. And so he is a participant in all of those things. And all of those things are changing him. And they're all examples of processes in the BFO sense of process. And now, because he's engaging in those processes, then he now acquires a religious belief of a much stronger and more explicit nature in the specific ideology of this specific Salafist group. And at the same time, he acquires the skills of a jihad fighter, which is an instance of martial skill. And these, in BFO terms, are dispositions. So they are tendencies or potentials that he manifests through his actions, which he is able to manifest because he's been trained to manifest. All right, so these processes produce these dispositions. That's what that means there. And then these dispositions are realized in a terrorist act. So he couldn't perform this terrorist act without these dispositions, and he couldn't have these dispositions unless he had been through those processes. So that's the kind of thing that the ontology can give you. It can give you connections, causal connections indeed, between different kinds of processes and between those processes and different kinds of institutions and persons and artifacts such as a website and so forth. Now, as I've already said, the basic thesis here is that a terrorist act is a speech act, or it's analogous to a speech act. It's an act of sending a message. And so the behavior of the terrorist is a combination of language on the one hand and violence on the other hand. And none of this is rocket science. It's all very obvious, but to write it down, it takes some work. All right, so how do we understand how language becomes coupled with violence, or how language becomes coupled with religion? Because to be part of a terrorist group is also to acquire specific kinds of linguistic dispositions. Well, this is where the ontology of language comes in. So this is the second part of this exercise. So the terrorist is trained to have skills of bomb making or planning or recruiting. Now, when we grow up, we are trained by our mothers, or by our parents, or by our friends, or by our school teachers to have specific skills, namely the skills of speaking Italian, or of speaking English, or of speaking French. So training can be applied, and is applied, not merely to, for instance, planning or bomb making. Training is involved also in acquiring the skill called language. And I want to put forward the thesis that a language is the aggregate of the competencies of all the people who are trained in its use. So all of the people who have the skills of speaking English are such that their skills, their competencies in speaking English, form a part of the English language. So a language is a collection of skills. It's the technical word which linguists use in this connection is competence. So it's a collection of competencies, and then performance is when you realize those competencies. And in BFO terms, a competence is a disposition. And now a dialect is a sub-aggregate. It's a part of that larger, big aggregate. So the Jamaican dialect of English is a proper part of the whole collection of skills, which is the English language as a whole. All right, so I was born in England. Specifically, I was born in Manchester. And in Manchester, I'm not going to imitate the Manchester accent. In Manchester, they actually have a number of different dialects. And I was born, so this is Manchester here. So they have posh dialects in the south where people are somewhat more wealthy. And then they have rough dialect. I was born at the border between the rough and the broad. So rough means also that the people who speak the rough dialect are rough people. They are the people who become football hooligans. So the dialect that they speak and the behavior that they engage in are both rough, because they're rough people. I escaped, became an ontologist. All right, so this is the English language, which is an instance of language, which is a kind of aggregate of dispositions, which is a kind of disposition, a big complex disposition, which is a kind of dependent continuant in BFO terms. And the Manchester dialect is an instance of the kind of dialect which is a part of a language. Every dialect is part of some language, I guess. A Creole is not a dialect, precisely because it contains components of multiple languages. All right, so the Manchester dialect is here, and of course there are parts of the Manchester dialect. Now, these complex aggregates of dispositions need mechanisms in order to be maintained from one generation to the next. Mothers are the most important mechanisms, but school teachers, TV, dictionaries, these are all part of this big mechanism which keeps the English language rolling along from one generation to the next. And in France, they have the Académie Française. Is there anything like that in Italy?
Accademia della Crusca, but not as
Do they?
not institutionally endowed.
Okay, no power. All right, so the training mechanisms are a bit like the training mechanisms used by the Salafist network to produce radicalized terrorists. But now, given what I've said, it's clear that the training mechanisms to create speakers of English and the training mechanisms to create, for instance, football hooligans they overlap. They are mutually interconnected. So, and they're cut not just linguistically and not just behaviorally, but also economically. So the people in the rough and broad parts and the poor parts here are all poorer than the people in the posh parts. And so there are divisions of behavior which have to do with how much money you have, where you go out to eat, if you go out to eat, and so on. All right, so the broad, rough, poor, posh division within the dialect. goes hand in hand with a broad, rough, poor, posh division amongst the behaviors of the people who speak those dialects. So if you have a disposition to rough Manchester speech, then you are very likely to have a disposition to rough Manchester behavior. And so, now this is language plus, you see. This is behavior. This is speech. And to behave like this, you have to have dispositions to behave like this. It's quite hard to behave badly. For instance, to be a football hooligan, to evade the police, to smuggle your weapons into the football ground. And of course, it all depends on which team you belong to. It's quite hard. It's hard. Well, anyway. All right. So you have to know the right words to say in order to be a proper fan of Manchester United rather than Liverpool. Now there are other language behavior interdependencies like this. So pilots and the people that run air traffic control centers in airports speak aviation English, which is a dialect of English, a very, very controlled dialect of English. And the behaviors that those people perform and the language they use are interconnected. And but not only the behaviors of the pilots and the air traffic controllers, but also the behaviors of the planes and the control systems. So the language that they speak is connected with the languages used to program the software that runs the air traffic control systems, and indeed that runs the planes to a large degree. So we now have not merely language plus behavior, we also have language plus behavior plus the driving of computer systems. And, well, so let's now talk a little bit about football hooliganism. So the person who is the football hooligan, this is all very old-fashioned. There aren't really football hooligans anymore, but it's such a nice comparison. And Scott Atran, actually, who is one of the world's leading experts on terrorism, puts this forward as one of the key ways of understanding why terrorists become terrorists. Why do people become football hooligans? Because they're parts of cliques, and you prove your clique membership by being as violent as the other clique members. And that's exactly what a terrorist clique is. It's just that instead of football, it's God who is the defining force, as we shall see. All right, so the football hooligan learns a certain dialect. It's a sub-dialect of the relevant local dialect. And that goes hand in hand with acquiring dispositions to violent pro-team behavior, which is realized in a process of thumping a fan of the other team. That's the idea. And now criminals are the same thing. So let's suppose we're talking about a petty criminal who has an underlying mental disorder which disposes him to random acts of violence in the street. Then this disposition is realized in thumping a random pedestrian. Here there is no message. This is not language plus. So there's nothing specific about the language which Jim speaks which makes him do this thumping. It's just random violence. And that's the difference between the random criminal and the football hooligan and the terrorist. Both the football hooligan and the terrorist are sending a message. All right, so the terrorist learns the sacred language of jihad, which is a kind of dialect. It's an ideolect. which in the relevant case is a sub-language of French, I guess. And this goes hand in hand with acquiring the disposition to acts of holy war. And now we have language plus here. So this is a dialect plus behavior aggregate. And it's realized in shooting of unarmed soldiers in Ottawa. And now we can talk about social bonds. So we're beginning to move towards obligation now. So we have the English language. Now the English language includes dispositions to use words like promise or pledge. I promise to finish before 3 p.m. That's part of the English language. I have a disposition to use those words. But when I do use those words, I'm engaging something which is more than language. I'm engaging a commitment. I commit myself. I put myself on the line. I become susceptible to being punished if I fail to realize my commitment. And so this is another example of a language plus behavior aggregate, but now the behavior is the behavior associated with realizing obligations which are made by using certain words. And we're going to talk about that in more detail in a minute. So the question is, and all of this is related to the sorts of things which John Searle has to say in giving his account of obligations. It's just that he doesn't have any of this fancy ontology. He doesn't have dialect behavior aggregates. What he has is the equivalent of rules of chess. So when we learn to speak English, it's like learning to play chess. And when you play chess, you always move your castle along the rectangular routes. You never go diagonally with the castle. And if you try and move the castle diagonally, you're just not playing chess. Similarly, if you use the words, I promise to do X, without becoming obliged to do X, whatever that means, then you're just not speaking English. You're speaking a different language. That's Searle's theory. Now, I think that there is a very important grain of truth in Searle's theory. But what I'm offering is a basis for the theory, and the basis of the theory really is training. People get trained to speak language plus. And then they're trained to make promises. They're trained not to break promises. They're trained to engage in different sorts of behavior, just as they're trained to speak language. It's all one thing, which is language plus. Okay. So how can mere speaking create social bonds? The idea is that when I'm trained to use the word promise, the people around me are trained to punish me if I break my promises. And I'm trained to punish them if they break their promises. And if there is no training to punish, then there is no obligation. That's the thesis, that obligation rests upon a widespread dispersion across the relevant society to monitor people who make promises and to punish them if they break promises. Now, the punishing may be very tiny. So the punishing for breaking a promise may just be that you turn up your nose, or you sniff, or you raise your eyebrow, or you mention to a friend, oh, Joe, he never keeps promises. That's a punishment, because that lowers Joe's social worth in some sense. But the punishment can also be going to jail, of course. Or it can be being beaten up in the middle of the night. That is what happens in the rough parts of Manchester. So to see whether this is right, you have to try and think of an example where an obligation exists, but there is no disposition to punish people who break that obligation. And my argument is that only in societies where there is a disposition to punish Is there the institution of obligation? All right, so that's the final part of this. I won't go through this in any detail. So first of all, let's talk about obligations in general. All societies have general dispositions. We all make decisions, we all make friends. There's a general disposition to care for your children. There's a general disposition to make promises, sign contracts, and so on. These are present in every society. Now, do we have an obligation to care for our children? I would say yes, and I think most people would agree. But that is not a language plus obligation. People who don't care for their children probably would be punished, but it's not something that we're trained to have. It's part of our biological makeup. I'm interested in those kinds of obligations which are not part of our biological makeup. So I'm interested in those kinds of obligations which arise, for instance, out of an act of promising. So these general obligations I'm not going to be talking about. The general obligation to keep our promises I'm not going to be talking about. I'm just going to be talking about the specific obligations which arise when you make a specific promise. For instance, I promise to finish this lecture before 3 o'clock. All right, now examples of such specific obligations are everywhere. And we're all affected by hundreds of them in every minute of our lives. So when you register as a student, you immediately and automatically acquire dozens of obligations to pay fees, to turn up for lectures, to study, to be ready to take exams, and so on. If you get employed, you automatically get dozens of obligations to turn up for work, to follow the instructions of your superiors, to follow all kinds of tiny regulations which you never read, which are part of your employment contract. Just as you're following all kinds of tiny obligations whenever you use a piece of software which you installed on your computer and which you agreed to the rules governing. So these kinds of obligations are everywhere. And if you have a big organization, then those obligations are multiplied exponentially because they're obligations affecting every single link here between every person in the organization, the people that they work with and the people that they work under. And the people who work under them, they have obligations to them also. All right, so let's just take the example of the promise. It's the simplest case. So John promises to mow Mary's lawn. And he thereby becomes obliged to Mary to mow the lawn. And Mary acquires a claim on John that he will mow the lawn. And these are mutually dependent. And they exist through time. And once John has mowed the lawn, then Mary's claim will disappear, and his obligation will disappear. So they have a specific temporal makeup. Now the question is, where do they go in BFO? So BFO is the king of ontologies, and everything has to fit. Where do obligations go? I do not know. I wish I knew. It would make me happier. I think I can say some things about obligations in BFO terms. So we talked about, they're not cognitive representations, so in other words, they're not the kinds of qualities that our mental acts have, which make them about something, but they involve cognitive representations. An obligation has to be such that you can know that you have it. An obligation has to be such that the person who will punish you if you break it not only can know that you have it, but does know that you have it, in the typical case anyway. So there are some of the things that we need to say about obligations we can say with the equipment that we have here. Perhaps also some of this. So the punishment has to be something bad, even if it's only very minor. And so the emotion ontology would give us some clues. But where do the claims and the obligations themselves belong? They're not dispositions. If you have an obligation, you almost certainly have a disposition to fulfill the obligation, but the obligation and the disposition are not the same. It's not a role. You have the role of being the obligee, the person who has the obligation. That's a role, but that's not the obligation itself. And the obligation is not an information artifact. It may be written down on a piece of paper, which is an information artifact, but the piece of paper and the obligation are two different things. All right, but role is getting pretty close. So this captures the mutual dependence of the obligant, the obligee, and the claimant, the obligee. And now I'm getting confused. The obligor has the obligation, and the obligee is the claimant. She has the claim. All right, so these are roles, and BFO knows how to deal with roles. And they exist because society treats people in certain ways. So the student role, the lawyer role, the manager role, the obligee role, the claimant role, these are all socially created realizable entities. They get realized in certain kinds of actions. For instance, fulfilling the obligation by mowing the lawn. But roles don't provide any kind of deontic pull. Or if they do, then that's something that has to be said in addition to saying that they are roles. So in virtue of what does being a student make you obliged to attend lectures? That's the missing piece of the puzzle here. All right, so let's look at dispositions. So when you make a promise, you have a disposition to perform, to actually realize the promise. I think that that's true. In the typical cases that we're talking about, the disposition may be very weak, and you may forget. You may lose the disposition 5 minutes later, or Mary may die, and you say, oh good, I don't need to mow her lawn. Although some people would say that you still are obliged to mow her lawn, even though she's dead. And Mary has a disposition to monitor whether you perform the obligation. And then she also has a disposition to claim that you do perform the obligation if the time arrives when you should already have performed the obligation and you didn't perform it. And that's where punishment enters in. And so now we have this much to say. And now let's just fill out the dispositions. So Mary, in fact, has 5 dispositions, or anyway, multiple dispositions. John just has one, to mow the lawn. Mary has an initial disposition to monitor, and maybe to shout at John, saying, don't remember, you have to mow the lawn. And then if he doesn't, she has dispositions to blame John, to shame John, to punish John in whatever way is relevant. And now this I think is getting closer. So I'm going to leave out all of this. And so I'm going to introduce now the society. So John and Mary are part of a society. I'm going to summarize, and then we can have some time for questions. John and Mary are part of a society. And Mary may not care much about the lawn, and she forgets. But Mary's neighbors, they don't like the fact that Mary's lawn is not being mown. And so Mary's neighbors are likely to start gossiping about John and his unfaithfulness or unwillingness or laziness. And so John will be punished. John will be liable to be punished. Not because Mary cares about the lawn, but because the society is there to punish him. Even if just by gossiping behind his back. And so now my thesis is the following. And it's not an ontology of obligations yet. It's an ontology of what must be there for obligations to be there. For obligations to be there, you have to have a mechanism in a society, which may be the society of USI professors, or it may be the society of master's students in the philosophy program, or it may be the society of friends of Marco. The society can be big or small, maybe the society of all Swiss people. There have to be mechanisms in that society to protect the makers of promises by punishing the breakers of promises whenever they are identified. Those mechanisms are, again, mothers, school teachers, friends, who, when you're growing up learning a language, you learn the institution of promising. And the institution of promising goes hand in hand with people having the disposition to punish promise breakers. And so the idea is that John and Mary's obligation and claim exist because they belong to a society in which children have been drilled to respect the institution of promising in a language plus sense, namely actually engaging in punishing behaviors, even though those punishing behaviors may just be more language, namely gossip in the form of, John is a slob, isn't he? Okay, that's the end. So now we have time for questions. Marco?
Okay, yes, I have a few questions. The main one, I'm not familiar with this approach, so I'm just reacting to what I learned right now. It seems to me that they are assuming a general capacity of developing dispositions as a result of certain training processes. But don't you think that, for example, the existence of this area of, say, morality or the ontology, obligations, and so on, presuppose some kind of special psychological infrastructure, so that not only the general ability to learn new dispositions as a result of training is in question, but also special psychological infrastructure which evolved to deal with obligations and so on. In that sense, there would be some more you need some more in your ontology, maybe not top ontology, maybe it's more intermediate level, saying that, okay, there are certain dispositions that cannot be developed unless there is a specialized psychological infrastructure which evolved for, I don't know, supporting human sociality.
Okay, so I think I agree with what you're saying. If I were trying to disagree, then I would point to the ways in which special kinds of societies and institutions like the mafia, for instance, succeed in training people to go against nearly everything which belongs to common morality. But then I would agree with you again, because I would say even in the mafia they have a tremendous faith in loyalty and so forth. And so they are just, yeah. So I think you're right, and I think it's an aspect that I need to think more carefully about. So I just said I wasn't dealing with those general dispositions, but I could say that those general dispositions are part of what makes possible the training in the specific dispositions that I'm talking about.
For example, in the not language plus, just language,
yes.
Language period. I think there are special dispositions to learn languages, to learn human languages. It's not.
Oh yes, I would agree with that. Yeah,
so something similar, but
yeah. And then there may be also general dispositions to adopt religious beliefs and so forth. Yep.
I have two questions actually. First one is an ethical one. So you said that, you seem to suggest that you're developing an ontology to spot terrorists something that can be useful to.
Yeah, I'm not personally doing that. I'm describing it as a thing that other people are already doing, in fact, in different contexts. And I'm just pointing out that this seems to be a useful thing to do, and that I tried to show how I would do it.
Right. So my worry is the following. I guess you have seen the movie Minority Report, in which people get arrested for crimes they did not commit yet.
Yep, right.
This calls for issues of social security and privacy.
Yep.
And I feel that the kind of social control that you get when you can identify who's most likely to commit a certain crime or to enter a certain association is terribly worrying. And I would like to know what's your opinion on the matter. To what extent we should just develop it as a tool and then let the politician do the moral job, or have that in mind while developing it?
So first of all, I think that you yourself must admit that what you do with the tool can be more or less bad. So in other words, if you use the tool just to create statistics about what goes on in a society, so you never use it to actually predict specific cases, then you would have no objection to that, presumably. Or you'd have lower level of objection.
Yes,
Good. And then if you used it to arrest people who didn't commit any crime, then you would have a very high level of objection. And so would I. So I guess I'm agreeing with you. Or I'm giving you reason to agree with me, let's say.
And my second question concerns the conception of language you proposed. You said that language is the aggregate of competencies of its users. And you used the word art a lot.
Yep.
Now, I like very much this idea. As a philosopher, I tend to be very suspicious with metaphors.
Yes. This is not a metaphor.
Well, for sure, saying that a dialect is a part of a language is not the same use of part that we have when we say that the wheel is a part of the car, right? Now, could you disambiguate, at least to some extent, that notion of parthood in order to avoid the somehow metaphorical use?
Good. I truly do not believe that it's metaphorical. So BFO has two very broad part relations. One is part relations between entities which continue to exist in time, such as people and planets, but also obligations and dispositions on the one hand, and then parts of processes on the other hand. So the first part of a football match is a part of the whole football match. And now we're interested in the first case. Now, let's suppose that people only speak one language and only have one dialect. So maximally. Maybe some people don't have any dialect, but just simplify the case. So then the collection of competencies of the people who speak the Lugano dialect of Italian is a subset, in fact, of the collection of competencies of people who speak Italian. It's as simple as that. So it's a part in the very strong sense. Every competence to speak Lugano Italian is a competence to speak Italian. And the one is smaller than the other, and so it's just a part relation, trivial.
Right. Okay.
Now it becomes somewhat less trivial given that we have people who can speak multiple languages and people who can speak multiple dialects. But it's still
intelligible, yes, I see what you mean.
It's still intelligible. Good. Any more?
Well,
Yes.
I have a question. It's about where exactly obligations fit into BFO. So I actually don't have the full tree of BFO in mind, but I guess you expect obligations to be dependent continuance,
Yep.
right? I was wondering whether they should specific or generic, and
Yep.
the thought is that an obligation might be transmitted to someone else.
Yep. Right. Good.
But I guess in some sense they are specific because you might think that once transmitted, the obligation is another one.
Yep.
It's not the original. And as regards which specific dependent continuant, I was wondering why not treating them as simple qualities. Of course, they are linked to some dispositions, and maybe you might be tempted to identify them with dispositions. So, for example, an obligation might be the disposition of being punished or being blamed if acting in a certain way, or being rightly punished.
Being rightly punished, that's the key.
Of course. But I mean, it's usual that qualities are linked with some dispositions
Yes,
under some conditions. So,
so the key problem is explaining what you might call the deontic pull, the oughtness, the should that's involved in obligation. And quality doesn't do that. It has to be something to do with realizable entity, which so it's either a disposition or a role, or there's some third kind of realizable entity. And now I would say you're right that there is also an attraction to the idea that the obligation might be a generically dependent continuum. Well, that means it can have multiple bearers. So I won't go into the details of it here, but I can owe him 10 francs. But then he sells my debt to someone else so that I now owe Marco 10 francs. And it's the same debt, but it's been transferred from being my obligation to him to being my obligation to Marco. And then his claim has been given to Marco. Now, you can't give specific dependent continuance from one person to another. You can't give me your headache. You can give me a similar headache. Now, it's certainly true that debts can be transferred like that, but not all obligations can be transferred, I think. But still, that just makes the issue more complicated. There is actually an even more tricky issue here. So I'll explain the issue in connection with offices. So the Pope holds the office of being the Pope. And there are periods when there is no Pope. Because when they are choosing the next Pope, there is no Pope. So what happens to the office during those periods? Is the office still there? What happens to the Pope role when no one is occupying it? Now, something similar might hold of claims. So it could be that it takes time for Marco to actually know that he is now the claimant. So what happens to the claim during interregnum? I don't know if that's an interesting issue. It's an issue that someone has to address at some point.
Could you comment on the difference between a disposition and capacity and a motivation?
So capacity is a term that we use capability. And we may be introducing an extra term to BFO called capability. And capabilities are those dispositions which bring benefits to their bearers or to their bearers' social group, family, and so on. So you have the capability to speak English. You also have the disposition to speak English. Your capability is the disposition. It's just that it's a disposition which brings benefits, so we call it a capability. And that's what a language is. It's a collection of capabilities.
And then how would you relate that to motivation? Because I may have motivation to use a certain disposition.
Yeah, so that is the problem. That's it's another version of the same oughtness problem, the deontic pull. What is your motivation to learn English? What is your motivation to speak English correctly?
And also to fulfill obligations.
And I think that the motivation to the obligation to speak English correctly, particularly when you're teaching your students, is something which gets trained into you when you're learning English. And that's why learning a language involves something like punishment. So punishment is already involved in learning the language. And that's why we have rough Manchester and posh Manchester. Posh Manchester is governed by more rules and the people follow them. Where rough Manchester, they don't care. Yes?
It's just a question. You seem to link obligation and punishment towards the end of your talk, and I just wanted to ask if you think that punishment is essential to obligation, or is more something that if you know there's punishment, then you know it's an obligation, so it's more about the heuristic of what an obligation is.
I don't think it's a heuristic, but I think you're right to say that in order to have an obligation, there's no necessity to have punishment directly related to it. But it's not a heuristic, because unless there is punishment of some form, in cases like it, then there is no obligation in it. And this is actually a kind of empirical thought experiment. Can you describe a kind of obligation which exists in this world, but there is no punishment for people who break it? And if you find an example, I'd be very interested to hear it.
I don't think I can find it now.
Well,
Think about it.
I'll give you 5 years. How's that?
But there are some examples, but they are just ill-formed cases of laws. There are some laws that prescribe certain behaviors that there is no punishment, which is specified in the law, but it's the law that is defective.
Yes. So then you're not really under any obligation to follow the law.
It's just they are classified as violating an obligation, but that's it.
Yeah. So then I think that proves my point, the way you're describing it now.
But we were discussing a couple of days ago, I mean, punishment is a little vague, because there are certain punishment which are costs, which are imposed of a member of a social group on the assumption that that member will go on being a member of the group and so on, so paying a ticket or even going to jail and so on. And there are other types of punishment which are actually exclusion from the social group, which I'm not sure they can correctly be classified as punishment exactly in the same sense as the previous ones. Because an effect of violating certain social rules may result into the exclusion from the social group.
And why is that?
I'm not sure that it is.
Why would that not be just a very harsh punishment?
Well, because it has a different function in a sense. The function of the first type of punishment is to keep you inside the group.
Yes.
The other one is to free the group of your presence. So I think that may be an important. I'm not sure. Maybe there are punishment type 1, type 2, but they're substantially different, I think.
Yeah, but I don't think they're different for my purposes. For my purposes, punishment is a gigantic spectrum, stretching from just a funny look to being killed, or being killed, and all your generations after you are going to be roasting in hell. It's like everything. And now, often punishment is misfire, so the person you're punishing by banishment doesn't care, because they want to leave the society anyway. But often, if you find somebody, they don't care, because what's 10 francs? I don't care, 10 francs. Yeah, I'll give you 20. In Finland, traffic fines are calculated as a percentage of your income. So if you're a millionaire, then it could cost you 100,000 francs for
In some places,
red light.
You cannot apply that everywhere, because in some places you do not declare your real income. So maybe in Finland they do.
All right, last question. Anyone?
insist on my suggestion.
Yeah.
I will ask you why you are not fully persuaded. So I suggested to treat an obligation as a quality.
Yep.
And you say that it lacks the specific deontic push
Yep.
of an obligation. But it seems to me that other qualities have maybe other kinds of pushes as well. So take electric charge, for example. No? So there is the push, the physical push of attracting or putting away other electrons.
Yes. That sounds metaphorical. But the whole idea of deontic push is metaphorical. That's why it's a hard problem, because you're trying to give a realistic, robust, literal interpretation of something which may be just a metaphor.
Yeah, but how you treat the relation between the quality of electric charge and the disposition to attract?
So that's the next chapter in BFO land. So we want to do a good job on physics. But let me just go back one step. So if obligation were just a metaphor, it would be easy. We would just say, oh, that's just a metaphor. But BFO is a realist ontology, and people have debts. Debts are real. People have obligations. They're real things. They're not just metaphors. Or rather, talk about obligation is not just metaphoric at all. There are real things. The problem is to say, well, they're like electric charge. That doesn't sound like a serious answer. Because that's physics. And obligations are just not physical. They're real, but they're not physical. And we have roles are real, but not physical.
Let me explain the reason of my question. So the reason of my question was this. You see a problem in a quality having a sort of push of some form.
Yeah.
I'm saying there seems to be a structurally similar problem with electric charge.
Yep.
So I expect any solution in that field to offer at least the chance of a solution to the specific problem.
Okay, so I am intrigued by your expectation, and I will puzzle over it. But so the initial idea, well, maybe obligations are like electric charge, seems to me bad. But the proper understanding of electric charge, so that we can understand the relation between the quality and the disposition, that sounds to me more promising. So I promise that I will think that through, and I'll let you know. And I have to keep my other promise. Now it's 3 o'clock. So this is the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you.